Hi everyone, hope you're having a great week. This week we're going to be focusing on IEPs, IFSPs, and 504 plans in the process. So first off, I wanted to start with a little bit of review. You may have touched on this in a previous course, or we touched on it a little bit earlier on this semester, but there's 6 principles of IDEA that it's important to really understand. The first is zero reject, and really that's just making sure that we're not excluding any student. We're really inclusive. The next thing we talked about was we discussed it in Module 4, which was about evaluation. So it's really important that the evaluations are non-discriminatory, meaning that we want to be really fair to every student to find out if there's a disability that's impacting their education. The next thing is FAPE, free and appropriate public education. We'll talk about that more in just a minute. And then also least restrictive environment, or LRE. And we'll talk about that in a minute as well, but that really is requiring schools to educate students with their non-disabled peers to the maximum extent possible. And that maximum extent possible part of that is really, really important. Then there's procedural due process, and those are the safeguards for families and students should there become a problem. And then, like we talked about in Module 3, the parent and student participation. So we talked about families and the importance of collaboration, and we talked about the fact that there's something written in IDEA that talks about the importance, but what does that really mean? So, the parent's voice in developing and carrying out those special education plans is critically important, and really just making sure they're an equal partner in that discussion and not just attending the meeting. So back to FAPE. There's been a lot of regulation over the years. The Board of Education versus Raleigh in 1982 really forced us to think about what is appropriate education. What does appropriate mean? Because it's really not. It's subjective. And the questions that have come up over the last 30 years are: does it mean Chevy or does it mean Cadillac? And most recently, Tracy touched on this earlier on the semester, but there was a recent case, Andrew, in 2017 that really got at FAPE and really forced us to really look at appropriate and, how much progress a student needs to make in their educational setting in order for that to be considered FAPE. The key to all of this is individualization. So it's really looking at the specific student's needs and figuring out what's best for that specific student. So a little bit more about least restrictive environment, or LRE. It's first was known as mainstreaming, then we started talking about it as integration, and now we refer to it as inclusion, essentially. And as we talked about earlier on the semester, it can benefit both students that with disabilities and those without. So I would argue that it's beneficial to have students included in the general education classrooms. But again, LRE needs to be determined by the individual student's specific needs, and the IEP team really needs to look at that specifically for that student. So then we talk about the continuum of services. You can see up on there's so many different places, ways that students can be educated, all starting from the general education classroom, which is the least restrictive, all the way down to the most restrictive, which is institutions. And again, it's really just looking at the individual student's needs and considering all of those 6 provisions of IDEA. So now we're going to move on to the IEP. So up on the screen there is the definition of what an IEP is. It's something that needs to be reviewed once a year, and from the age of 3 all the way until they move to adult outcomes. And really, as we talked about earlier, it really is, it comes up with goals and many other things so that the team itself can really figure out how to best support that student during that year. So what's in an IEP? First off, present levels of educational performance. So, where's the students at? How are they performing right now? Then they move on to, once you determine that, you can come up with measurable goals and benchmarks. And so you can't really come up with a goal unless you really know where they're at, what is their, math levels, all these other things. And then it talks about assessment status. Every 3 years, we talked about, assessments and evaluations need to be given, and an IEP will contain the status of those assessments. And then IEPs will also talk about special education and related services and supplemental aids and services. And you'll read more about all of this in your readings this week. It does mention in IDEA that all of these services needs to be based on peer-reviewed research to the extent practicable. So that's not always easy to do, but it's just really important to remember that that is something that we want to strive for. And it also, the IEP will talk about the extent of which the student will not participate with students. How often will they be in the gen ed classroom, and how often will they be outside the gen ed classroom? And it talks about and gives percentages and amounts of time that will occur, and it's very specific. The IEP includes modifications in the administration of assessments. So, for instance, an older student, if they are doing any of those assessments, preparing for the ACT, the SAT, there'll be modifications that will help those teams for those planning purposes figure out what would work for the student. And dates for beginning the services and the modifications, how often those services will be provided, where they'll be provided, and how long they'll be provided. And then lastly, what the progress is towards the annual goals and how it will be measured. So again, we talked about, and we'll get into this a little bit later in the semester, about how you have to have measurable goals and how do you determine what a measurable goal is. But the important thing is that the goals have to be something that you can measure progress towards. And so it's important for the IEP team to really talk about that as those goals are being created, and really discuss how the parents are going to be informed of that progress. So not just, at the IEP meeting every year, but on a regular basis, how are you going to inform the parents? I mean, as we talked about, the IEP can be changed on a regular basis. So if the team comes up with the goal and they decide that they need to adjust it in any way, they can do that. But how are they going to let the parents and the other team members really know what the progress is so that those decisions can be made? And for some students, these other items are included on the IEP as well. For an individualized family services plan, so that's the birth to 3, it's fairly similar, but it's reviewed at 6-month intervals or more if it's necessary. It's a family services plan, so it is very much more family oriented instead of student specific. But it describes the services that the infant and the toddler and the family will receive. So it's the infant, toddler, and family will receive. And again, it's developed within 45 days of the time of referral. So just like an IEP has very specific deadlines, IFSPs also have deadlines as well that the team needs to follow. And then there are other laws that can help students. Section 504, the Rehabilitation Act, and we talked about that earlier on this semester. And then ADA. So ADA is something that it helps access to schools, facilities, buildings, things like that, and just make sure that those students with disabilities are treated fairly. So 504 plans, the intent is to level the playing field. As we talked about earlier on in the semester, it prohibits discrimination. It talks about accommodations, modifications. Again, evaluation data is necessary to determine what is going to be work well for the student. And the students would get non-discrimination protection, some procedural safeguards, again, accommodations, and it's possible to receive related services on a 504 plan as well. So I wanted to spend some time talking about transition planning because it's something that I think that there's some confusion on. So it varies, but generally speaking, around the age of 16, um, there's a requirement in the IEP that we need to talk about transition. So what does that mean? So transition planning summarized means we really need to think about and talk to the student about what does he want to do? What do they want to do after high school? How are they going to get there? And who is going to help them, help the student, and when are things going to be done? So again, it's trying it's a way to determine goals for those transition periods, um, and it forces the team to really think about what the future is going to look like and determine, what goals are going to best get the student there. So I wanted you to start off just kind of think about from a personal perspective. Is there a time in your life when you went through a transitional period? What was the goal of that transition? What types of things did you accomplish to accomplish that goal? Who helped you during this period? And were there certain things that needed to be completed in a time frame? So I think it's important to just sort of think back and put it into perspective because it's very similar to what happens in an IEP meeting. Um, Unfortunately, IEP meetings sometimes can be very, there's a short time frame. It's very specific. A lot of times it's not quite as collaborative, but I think just putting yourself and really just thinking about the transitions that you've had in your life can really help figure out how to best serve the student that you're talking about if you're in a meeting where they're talking about transition planning. So a little bit more about what transition planning is. It is a partnership that includes the student and their family. So I am a proponent for early student involvement in their IEP meetings. So, but per IDEA, students need to be involved at least when they start working on transition planning, which is generally at age 16. It's a partnership with also the school and post-school personnel and local community representatives and employers. So those post-school personnel, like there could be vocational rehabilitation consultants that come. If a student is interested in working in the communities, parents or that team might invite others to come in, potential employers, internships, all those types of things. They can be invited and attend, and it can be a partnership between all of those people together. So a little bit back to the student. I think it's really important, my personal experience with my son, we did not invite him to the IEP earlier than age 16. And I just remember that meeting when he turned 16 and they said, he needs to come to the meeting. And he didn't even know what his IEP was. And they all turned to him and kind of looked at him and said, what do you want to do with your life? There was nobody else there. Nobody had talked to him about it before us besides my husband and I. And he just, there's all these people in the room just staring at him. And, he's a typical teenager. He didn't know what he wanted to do with his life after high school. And so that can be scary. And, he gave some sort of answer. But I think it could have gone a different way. And, the meetings after that, I really educated him to what is your IEP. I had him review his IEP every year. And I talked to him before going into each IEP meeting about what are your goals for the year? What are your goals for after you graduate from high school? And let's think about what IEP goals and what needs to happen this year in order to reach those goals. And it's very specific planning that we did. We did some of it before we went to the IEP meetings, but and then we were ready to talk about that with the IEP teams once we got there. But it took several years for us to get to that point. And so that's why I think transition planning is really important for everybody to really understand kind of what that looks like and the benefits of really like asking the student and the family how they see the future for them, either the student for themselves and the family for their child. So this planning will allow a student to choose a living arrangement, obtain a career, and develop independent and community living skills, access post-secondary education, and moving into the adult world. And so you can see how goals related to accomplishing these things might be a little bit different than the strictly academic goals of, you know, math, writing, things like that. So, there might end up being goals related to self-determination, self-advocacy, just, really goal setting, doing research on different colleges or careers or jobs, and things that, where might they want to live. Maybe there's life skills that need to happen in order for them to live independently. So all of those things come into and are incorporated into a transition plan. So as I mentioned before, transition planning involves thinking past high school. It's individualized. It outlines the total school experience, and it should be student driven, not professional driven. So, when I talked about my son coming at the age of 16, I feel like that was very professional driven. And so it took us some time to really shift that focus so that it really is very student driven. And again, it's about the student dream. So I, for instance, asked my son, "What's your dream? How do you see yourself in 5 years, this year, 5 years, 10 years, and how can we get you there?" And it's based on the specific student's abilities and deficiencies. And as I mentioned, it's not an add-on activity. It's not something that, oh, we're doing the IEP meeting, oh, we got to add a transition paragraph in. Nope, it should be a very specific thing that you do to involve the student in planning for their future. And it's more than just paperwork, obviously. So you can see here, like I mentioned before too, there's a ton of individuals that are involved in the transition planning process, and it really depends on what the student's needs are. The transition component of the IEP is developed first to drive the development of the IEP goals and objectives and the services. So you have to come up with what that long-term goal is and then tie all those goals back into it. And it's focused on long-term post-secondary goals, not short-term instructional goals. So there can be short-term too, but it's really focused on that long-term. And it outlines what's going to be done very specifically, what transition activities are going to happen, who's going to do them in order for that student to reach those goals, and who's responsible. So what are post-secondary goals? I mentioned it a few minutes ago, but it's outcomes that occur after the student's exited high school and is no longer eligible for services. It must be written for employment, post-secondary education or training, and independent living. Just like other IEP goals, they must be measurable, and it's not just a process of pursuing or moving towards a goal. And we should try to make sure that the goals don't leave gaps, and that the most important thing is that they're based on student preferences, interests, needs, and strengths. Again, student-driven. So measurable post-secondary goals include a behavior action that can be observed or measured, identifies what the goal accomplishment is, when the goal will be completed, how progress will be measured, and results in multiple evaluators coming to the same conclusion regarding the accomplishment of that goal. So this is another way to really kind of show how those goals are written. And you can see that visually on the screen. So here's a list of some types of goals that you might see in transition plans. So for each post-secondary goal, there must be at least one annual goal or goals included in the IEP that will help the student make progress towards those post-secondary goals. And here's some things to keep in mind when determining transition-related IEP goals. What skills and knowledge must be attained that will be necessary for achieving those goals? What skills and knowledge does the student already currently have that support those goals. So what's their present level? Where are they at right now? Does the IEP goal support the accomplishment of those goals? So are the services and things like that in the IEP, are those the appropriate services and things that will support the student to accomplish those goals? And is every post-secondary goal supported by at least one IEP goal? And how does the IEP goal support the post-secondary goal? Does it increase skills, enhance access? And most importantly, if the IEP goal is accomplished, will the student be closer to reaching their dreams after graduation? And that's usually what I do when we have a proposed transition goal, and we're looking at whether this is a good goal, is that, will this help the student get closer to their dreams? And if the answer is yes, then I say that it's a good goal. And I usually suggest to the team that we should keep that in there. So here's some pointers. Again, have the student participate in their IEP meeting as early and as much as possible. So I'm starting to have my 9-year-old, for instance, attend his IEP meeting. And it looks, participation looks different at age 9 than it does at age 16. But I think it's important for him to understand that there's a team of people here to support him, and that what is an IEP meeting, what is an IEP, what accommodations, modifications, what services does he receive, and really just understanding it, being comfortable talking to the team about any problems that they're having and what's going well during the year. And then as they get older, the participation in those meetings can increase and change over time. You want to start planning early and start asking questions about the student's needs in middle school or sooner. Even though, we know as teenagers things can change frequently. Help the student talk about their dreams and goals. So don't just come into the meeting like happened with my son and just say, what do you want to do with your life? What are your dreams? Because I know as an adult, I don't, sometimes that's hard for me to articulate what I want for the future. And it's probably hard for the student too. So, having the family talk to the student ahead of time, having the people who are working mostly with the student, talking to them about their dreams and goals prior to the meeting, just to get them to prepare them for the discussion. And planning should be based on preferences, interests, needs, and strengths. Again, measurable goals that relate to what's going to happen after high school, and work on job skills for employment, and prepare the student to know about the supports and services that they'll need after high school, and to assist them with their college coursework, or if they're not going to college, for a job or whatever they plan on doing. And I know that's a hard transition, because a lot of times, if you don't involve the student earlier on, then they may not be prepared for advocating for their own services and supports that they need after high school. And at that point in time, the parents aren't going to be able to, do that for them. They're going to have to do that for themselves. So in summary, remember, transition planning is the student's vision of what they want for the future. It's all about the student. It's student-led. It's not professional-driven. And it's really important. So that's all I have for you for this week. I hope you enjoy your readings and the projects this week. And please feel free to shoot me an email if you have any questions at all. Thank you so much, and have a good week, guys.